Hello, everyone. Welcome to Stories That Work. I am your host, Deacon Adam Roberts.
And I am your co-host, Father Matthew Howell.
And we should start with a prayer.
We should. All right. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. O heavenly King, O Comforter, the Spirit of truth, who art in all places and fillest all things, the treasury of good things and giver of life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O good one. Amen.
Amen. Do you have any updates?
I've got one update. My daughter Hannah is in 6th grade, and she is taking Father Alex McCool's New Testament class through the St. Athanasius Academy. It's once a week for 50 minutes, and then he assigns homework, which is reading chapters of the Gospels. And she loves the class. So shout out to Father Alex McCool. You are really doing a great job engaging your students about the New Testament, especially the Gospels. Next semester, it'll be the rest of the Acts and the epistles, the rest of the New Testament. But he's killing it right now. And it's really exciting to see my daughter reading the Bible and enjoying it and looking forward to class. So that's my update.
Yeah. When I was talking to him about teaching the class, he goes, "Okay, what do you want me to do?" And I said, "I want to get them to care about the New Testament."
He's doing just that.
That's it. I don't care about anything else.
So this is a plug. A shout out to Father Alex, and a pat on the back and an attaboy to Father Alex, and also a plug for the St. Athanasius Academy Orthodox Studies classes.
Awesome. Okay, I have two updates.
Okay.
One, some of you may have missed our outreach conference. That's okay. It's still in the Facebook group. So if you're a member of the Facebook group for Antiochian Missions and Evangelism, the conference is there. It's recorded, but you have to kind of sort through the whole 4 hours. In about a week, we're going to upload it to YouTube. And if you find the links or you registered, you'll get a link to the YouTube channel where it will be uploaded in 7 separate episodes, so you can watch the ones that might relate more to you. There were so many great ideas, and what I want to share, that really the takeaway from that was that we don't have to push pause in the middle of COVID-19. There are actually new and unexpected outreach opportunities, or you might be doing an outreach opportunity that needs to shift. You don't shut it down. I mean, people are still doing prison ministry. People are still, feeding. There's so many things happening. So we went through 7 different presentations of how, instead of people pushing pause, they adjusted what they're doing and say, okay, what can we do? Let's focus on what we can do. And that's who we are. And so a year ago, you heard about us doing evangelism, digital evangelism. This year, we did outreach. And next year, we're planning on doing, a year from now, when we do our next online conference, we're planning on doing one on missions, missiology and missions. And there's a lot of great information out there. I think you're going to love it. But then the second update, so we can move along, because I want to get our guest on. I'm so excited about our guest, who really relates. It's not often that we have a guest who probably knows more about the title than our show than we do. So I'm pretty excited about that. But that's definitely happening today. The second thing I want to tell you about that we're working on, and I'm just giving you the teaser. If you're like me, you've probably had problems inviting people to church. Either you invited them and it didn't go well in the invitation. Maybe it turned into an argument. Maybe it got awkward. Maybe you're scared to bring it up at work or with your friends. Or you brought them and they hated it, and now it's awkward. Or you didn't know how to answer their questions. There's so many different ways that inviting someone to church can fall apart. We're working on a webinar that's going to be coming up in the future, how to invite people to church. And it has so much great information. We've gathered so many amazing tips so that you can begin working on this. And I think you're going to be surprised with the stuff that we found. And it's not one of those static things. Inviting someone to church 10 years ago was different than it is today. It was different 20 years ago. This is not like we've found the silver bullet and it's going to work for the rest of your life. No, that's not what we're saying. But we do think we have a lot of great tips that are applicable right now, and a lot of important information. And this is an area where we could do a better job. We can do such a better job. And a lot of it is either ignorance or we failed at it and we're scared and we don't want to mess it up. It's like you get that one shot and you don't want to mess it up. So I just want to let you know that teaser that we're working on a webinar, how to invite people to church. And it's going to be really exciting. The outline already is blowing me away.
Okay. Sounds great.
So we're ready for our guest, Deacon Nicholas Kotar.
Hello, hello.
Yes, and I'm thankful to have you on. Just in case we have people who don't know who you are, do you mind doing like a 1-minute autobiography before we get into your content?
I'm laughing because if I did the full autobiography, it wouldn't be a minute. It would be longer, and that's not self-praise. That's just the idiot over here who does too many things because he doesn't understand that time is limited 24 hours in a day. But anyway, I'll give it a shot. I'm an Orthodox deacon. I serve at Jordanville in upstate New York, where I teach music, and we're working on we call it the Applied Music and Liturgics program over at the seminary. So I'm in charge of that. I write fantasy fiction. I have a podcast on Ancient Faith Radio. It's called In a Certain Kingdom, where I retell fairy tales and then analyze them a little bit without destroying the heart of the tale, just kind of letting people understand what the tale is about and how it can help us lead a little bit of a better life. And in general, I like to talk and teach about how literature and how good stories are useful and sometimes inevitable if we want to teach ourselves how to become virtuous and how to lead good Christian lives, and also how to show that to others.
Okay. Well, I'm going to share a couple of things of why you caught my attention. One, I think it's important that we admit we have a rich history of great literature in the Orthodox Church. But how much of that is continuing? Like, are we continuing this tradition of great fiction, great literature, great novels, right? And it's like, I think sometimes we can just get caught up in saying we're going to read all this stuff, but we don't have to make any new great books.
Yeah.
And you're a part of this.
Yeah. Well, it's time. It's time. I mean, we've gotten to a point. I think of the time periods in the Byzantine Empire where you think of the 4th, 5th century, that time of golden blossoming, where you had the best minds and the best things ever written in the history of mankind. And then, you wait a few centuries and you have the period of, how would you call it? Kind of summarization in the 9th century and a little bit afterwards, where it's almost like everybody felt everything's been said already, and the best we can do is kind of preserve it as much as we can. But the problem, of course, with preserving is that you stop its development, you stop it growing, and you assume that if everything that can possibly be said has been said already, then you start going down a very dangerous path of suggesting that the written word, culture, even hymnography, art, have already done everything they can, and the best you can do is just continue in an existing tradition. But that's not what tradition is. Tradition is a living thing. Tradition is something that is relived, that is reinvigorated. Of course, it has to come from the same rich soil that has inspired those masters who came before you and who were much better than you. And when it comes to literature, we're seeing this very clearly, because most Orthodox people perhaps will read Dostoevsky and will say, or many people have come to Orthodoxy, I think, through reading something like Dostoevsky. And they'll sit there and they'll say, well, it's been done. Look at this great book. I'm going to read it 55 times in the course of a lifetime. And every time I read it, of course, there's going to be more and more interesting things that I find out about it, granted. But to suggest that actually writing fiction for an Orthodox person is something that's good, well, you'll get some scandalized gasps every once in a while. And my assertion is that couldn't be farther from the truth. We need to reinvigorate, not simply preserve the tradition.
Yeah, I think. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to pause. Like, if you have more, I'm happy to just sit here and listen and just keep going.
Yeah, tradition is not static.
No,
it's not static.
As soon as it becomes static, it starts to die. I mean, that's. Mm-hmm. And being from the Russian tradition, that's something that's very close to home, because there's a good argument to be made that the revolution happened because the church became too static, because the Russian Orthodox Church became too comfortable with where it was, and I mean, I'm not a reformer by any stretch of the imagination. I'm a member of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. So if I was a reformer, I'd actually probably go up and smoke immediately. But no, it's unfortunate that a lot of people think that way, especially when it comes to literature, because it used to be assumed that that the creation of the written word, whether that is fiction or nonfiction, is simply natural for a human being to engage in. And to suggest that it's something that we should avoid doing because it distracts us from our true calling, which is to, I don't know, pray all the time, I guess, is actually entirely beside the point, because good literature can actually, it can actually orient our heart into that place where prayer becomes much easier. And it's true, I think, without a doubt, that those people who do not engage in these activities that warm the heart, of which storytelling, reading, and writing literature are actually very, very useful things to do that. Those people might think that they engage in constant prayer, but what they're engaging in is self-delusion for the most part, because we don't have that rich tradition passed on from elder to elder to elder in the world. You know, we don't know how to pray, and it's unlikely that we're going to find somebody who's going to lead us by the hand and give us the entire secret of how to live a hesychastic life. The best that we can do is to constantly warm up and reanimate our experience, our lived experience of beauty, because it's through an experience of beauty that we warm up our hearts, that we forget about ourselves, that we participate in a communal act, sometimes communing with people who lived centuries before in a very interesting and living way. And that's the kind of thing that takes you outside of the grind, outside of the everyday reality of what you are, of the constant strain of living in this world, especially in COVID-19, and especially in the post-pandemic age. We need it more than ever. So I'm a big proponent of that sort of approach, both to reading and to writing.
Well, Saint Gregory of Nazianzus has the famous quote when talking about Christ's will: "That which is not assumed is not saved." Right?
Yes.
And the idea that Christ, like in the church, we try to redeem and sanctify every single part of us, right, and bring it in line with Christ. Mm-hmm. Why wouldn't we try to baptize the imagination?
I mean, you said the phrase, baptize the imagination, is exactly right. And where you're going, and I'm interrupting you, Father, I apologize, but it's our Christ, our incarnate God, is a God who tells stories. It's right there. It's very, very clear. And I think there's something profound about that. It's not, a lot of people will admit that fact. Yes, he told parables, fine, but they're parables. They're not fairy tales, right? They're parables. They're not fiction, and fiction is false, and therefore, since it's false, it's a lie, and it belongs to the devil, right? Well, actually, no. What Christ was doing was participating in a storytelling tradition that came from a more ancient storytelling tradition that is in no way more special than any other storytelling tradition, except that this was the tradition that would have spoken most obviously and most directly to the heart of the people that he was engaging with. And there's something profound about this, because how many of us have gotten distracted by this kind of rationalized Christianity, where we go straight to the explanations of hesychasm, the explanations of a life lived in virtue, the explanations of a life of constant prayer, and think that by engaging with these books, that we are somehow automatically becoming assumed into that kind of a lifestyle, when actually all we're doing is exercising our own self-importance very often. While what the stories do is they bypass the rational faculty almost entirely, and they provide a shared lived-in experience of the characters in the story enacting a certain very specific and oftentimes very simple truth that you can understand on the level of gut, on the level of shared emotion, on the level of community, on the level of heart. And we are the church of heart. We pray through the heart. We engage with others through the heart. We are saved through our heart, not through our brain. So, yeah.
Well, it seems like, based on what you're saying, I agree with you. We go to the explanations so that we can become experts.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
But if we're reading a story, so to speak, rather than getting the mechanics, we're getting formation.
Yes.
And the formation, what you are arguing, what you are explaining to us, is that the formation is just as impactful, if not more so, than the mechanics, than the instruction guide, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And what do Americans want more than to be an expert, though? Right?
Yes.
We want to watch our 10-minute TED Talk, and then we're an expert about urban gardening or whatever it is that we watch it on. Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like that's part of our American culture right now. We think we can digest anything in a small bit and be an expert and then have a valid opinion about it. And the storytelling, the stories that we read or encounter they don't enable us to be an expert. It's a slower process.
It's a humbling process because
yes.
what ends up happening, and there's some really fascinating neurobiological research on what parts of the brain, what parts of the body are actually involved and turn on when you read stories. And it's very clear that the parts of the brain that are activated when you read are actually motor neurons. So it's the parts of the brain that orchestrate your own movement. So if you read about somebody walking, your brain simulates walking. So what ends up happening is you, as a reader, have a very humbling experience of not self. And if the story is good, and this is a big if, of course, and this is one of the reasons why not all objections to, should we read are invalid, because there are stories that can actually be very bad for you, precisely for this reason, because it's so visceral and it's so much a kind of erasing of self in order to participate in the experience of other as told in the story, that it actually can be kind of dangerous if you're reading the wrong kinds of stories. But if to answer your point about experts, I've been doing a lot of thinking about this, and I think that the way we react on social media is very much a part of what you're talking about, how we believe that we can become experts in a very short period of time. And I don't think it's necessarily a part of American culture so much as it is a rather recent development. I think self-startership is an American thing. Entrepreneurialism is an American thing. But both of those things are actually quite humble on a certain level, because they assume that although I have this drive to go and do and to go and change and to go and create, I recognize that I'm probably going to fail a lot before I actually get to that point, right? So to become an expert, I have to become absolutely nothing, right? But what this new and very strange manifestation of experthood, I think it has to do with social media, and it has to do with it's a much more recent manifestation of Facebook and Twitter, where the algorithms are self-fulfilling prophecies, because they basically give us what we click and what we do. So they just feedback loop the kinds of things that we tend to react to. And since social media is built in such a way not to encourage thoughtful discussion and storytelling, rather it encourages angry emotion, or any kind of extreme emotion, whether it's angry or extremely positive, it doesn't even matter. But what that ends up doing is that if you spend too much time on it, and there's some interesting scientific research on this as well, is that you begin to think that you're an expert because your entire worldview is conditioned by the things you see on Facebook and Twitter. But Facebook and Twitter only feeds you what it thinks you want, not what it thinks you need, because they want you to spend as much time as possible on it so that they can profit off of your clicks and off of your time spent. So this is a rather recent phenomenon. It's a very disturbing phenomenon. It's changing the way that we relate to each other, certainly. And actually, reading stories and storytelling is a fantastic antidote to this sort of thing. Because to read any sort of story, you have to engage deeply. The brain doesn't have the same kind of superficial engagement as it does with a tweet. When you have to read, in order to read more than half a page, your brain has to go into kind of overdrive mode. And the same is certainly true when you write. And writing is definitely the more humbling of the two, because you realize just how pointless and terrible you are, even if you've read many books, even if you've written one or two books. Every time you sit down to write again, it's like you're starting from scratch.
I can't help but wonder, Father Matthew, like how much of this really actually the expertise idea is from staying in Holiday Inns?
Yeah, remember the old commercial, Deacon Nicholas? Like, are you a guy stops at a car accident? Are you a doctor? No, but I stayed at a Holiday Inn Express last night.
Yes.
I think there's a strong correlation there. I'm just going to say my counter argument is that all this is from Holiday Inn.
Yeah,
maybe you're right.
That was the beginning of it. Yeah.
No, I think this is an exact place to explore that what you're talking about, this phenomenon of everybody's an expert and how it's changing storytelling. It's just shocking at that how we're losing. America in some ways is losing the art of storytelling, which is why we have a hard time talking about religion and politics. Because when you tell a story, there's a meaning there that goes, okay, I get the story. There's nuance, right? It's complicated. Stories are complicated. Mm-hmm. And I don't want it to be complicated. I want it to be this way politically or this way religiously, right?
Yes. Well, and part of the problem here is that this, in particular, this generation and the generation just before, was on the cusp of something happening in the educational institution and in the family institutions, where any sort of possibility of a shared storytelling inheritance was lost. And part of the problem is that America doesn't have a mythology. Like some European countries do. The Scandinavians have their very strong mythology. The Russians have a very, very strong storytelling tradition that everybody knows about, even if it's only through Soviet cartoons of a certain era. Even that is high art compared to some Disney films. Just because it participates in the same age-old traditions that the storytellers have been propagating for centuries, almost a millennium. America doesn't have that. America doesn't have a shared mythology, doesn't have a shared... there's certain things that could be used as it, but it hardly covers everybody. And the new way that we're teaching our children in the last generation or two presupposes that it's not so important that we have a shared storytelling tradition, much of which could be, by the way, the stories of the Old Testament and the New, as told to children. That could be our shared storytelling tradition, but oftentimes that's not there. And how many people nowadays simply don't even know what the stories of the Bible are. And what happens? They end up having an extremely flat worldview that isn't nuanced in any way, that doesn't allow for the possibility of transcendent realities. And how strange it is that it would take something as simple as a fairy tale, which seemingly doesn't talk about spiritual realities, but a shared experience of telling that fairy tale from grandparents to parent to child, that actually animates a worldview that makes it possible to experience the ineffable and the transcendent in everyday life, not only in church. And that's definitely what happens to nations who have a strong storytelling tradition. They tend to be a lot more spiritual. That doesn't mean the spirituality is a good one, but it's there. And what we see in the U.S., especially now, in the West largely, is almost entirely a flattening of the worldview that doesn't even allow for the possibility of there being any kind of transcendence. Unfortunately, it's seeping into the Orthodox Church too.
So
can we go ahead?
I was going to say, can we talk about some of the mechanics of storytelling?
Yeah, absolutely. If that's interesting to you all.
Before we go there, I want to address something that I think is interesting. We had a guest a few weeks ago that introduced an idea I had never heard of, and I'm curious if you've heard of this, because there's an element of what you're saying that I think is definitely true. Like I love what you're talking about, the shared story, the shared mythology, right? Mm-hmm. But we did an episode a few weeks ago on Black Panther. Mm-hmm. And our guest was Father Turbo Qualls, and he talked about how specifically for definitely I would say for the African American community, Black Panther or certain comic books is like an American mythology, right? Yeah. And that would be so for me as well. And then, but we're talking nuance. I don't know how shared that is across the country. I know a lot of men and boys, right? But is this heavily centered on males? And it may not be shared across female. Well,
and Father Turbos did say it's the closest thing we have.
Yes,
that's right.
To shared mythology, right?
Yeah, and it's interesting that he should say that. Now, I'm no expert in African American mythology or storytelling, but I have read several interesting articles that actually suggest that there might be more than just simply Black Panther, but that they might have lost it over the past century or so, but there was a very strong storytelling and musical tradition that was happening on the slave plantations for several hundred years. I'm not an expert, so I'm not going to speak anymore about that, but talking about interesting examples of shared mythology, that's certainly something that could be researched more, especially now. But in terms of the mechanics of story, Father Matthew, as you were asking, it's a very pointed and useful question, because from this I'm going to be quoting not directly, but from the thought of J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings. He has a wonderful essay called On Fairy Stories, where he very directly says that the shape of most fairy tales doesn't matter where they come from. It doesn't matter whether they come from the West or from the Far East or from Africa or from anywhere. They tend to have a similar rhythm and a similar structure. And that structure, basically, with some variations, is what we call the hero's journey or the monomyth. Now, everybody says, oh, Joseph Campbell's monomyth. No, he didn't write it. Surprise, surprise. He made it popular. He popularized it. It wasn't even his idea. He was basically riffing on the psychology of Carl Jung. But Carl Jung was talking about universal archetypes. He wasn't talking about something that he had come up with, as he was walking around having deep thoughts, as philosophers do. But rather, he was consolidating the shared experience of humanity, no matter where they come from, and drawing it out in the shapes of stories. And you can find it anywhere. You find it in the Bhagavad Gita. You find it in the Ramayana. You find it in, guess what? In the life of Christ. And this is what's really interesting, is that Tolkien says it's not, and the secular way of looking at it would be, oh, then your gospel is just another manifestation of this ancient story form that showed up way back when. And so yours is just one tradition among many that is trying to reach at universality. Never mind the fact that no faith, no religion has such universal claims as Christianity. None of them even try, or none of them have tried in the history of mankind. And why? Because the whole assertion that Tolkien taps into, and that the Orthodox Church insists on, is that the experience of our faith is universally human. It's for everyone. And so when Christ reveals the contours of the hero's journey in his life, what he is doing is providing a historization of myth. He's providing the true myth by showing that all of the stories that people have been telling beforehand were actually prophecies of his coming, and were kind of the heart's call and the heart's desire to find the archetype of this story, the actual happily ever after writ large over the entire cosmos. And that also means that every story that is structured in the same way after the coming of Christ is reminding us of it. So it doesn't invalidate the form. So it's not like, since Christ came and made the hero's journey, the monomyth, history, then we should never write or tell another story, and we should only read and tell histories. That's not what it means. Because histories are a different kind of engagement with the self. They're first and foremost not an engagement with the heart. And so, in fact, any reenactment of that story is in some way a recapitulation of Christ's own life and death. That's why, by the way, the superhero stories are so effective, and why so many people like them, because they talk about exactly that arc in much simplified language, of course, and in much simpler images. And I will say that that's one of the reasons why Marvel's recent direction into more woke storytelling is probably going to end up in a lot of lost money, because as soon as you start subverting the story that everybody feels is the right story, some people are going to be like, yes, subversion, we love it, this is so cool. But those people, there's not that many of them, and eventually they get sick of it, because there's only so many times you can subvert something until it flips around and becomes the original thing again, at which point you've just subverted the subversion and just told the story of Christ in a different way. So it's almost inevitable that all good stories follow the rhythm and structure of the life of Christ.
It's interesting that you bring this up about the woke influence, because we've seen this also affecting another heavy franchise that Disney owns in Star Wars.
Yeah,
they added in some woke elements, and there was major pushback saying, no, take your wokeness and your politics out of Star Wars.
And notice what happened
Just-
immediately afterwards. They
Just
made the
give us our
Mandalorian.
fantasy. Yeah.
No, look, they made the Mandalorian, and the Mandalorian is like paint by numbers hero's journey. You
Yes.
can literally say this is the episode that does, the mentor. This is the episode that shows the apparent victory. This is the episode that shows the descent into hell. And it's very clear, in terms of the imagery, in terms of the structure of the episodes, in terms of the music, the types of characters he interacts with. And guess what? Everybody loves the Mandalorian. It's much more than the latest trilogy. I mean, this is not even an argument.
Yeah. No, it's quite interesting that you mentioned that aspect of it. In terms of storytelling, we're actually have reached an interesting time in Hollywood that I don't know if you've noticed this, but typically, and I'm going to scandalize some people who don't know this, but a number of our quote unquote mega stars from Hollywood, they got their start by playing certain types of roles in certain movies. Something that we would frown upon, okay? And that was the moment where he said, if you'll play this type of character, we can open doors for you moving forward.
Yeah.
And so I'll give you some examples. Tom Hanks in Philadelphia. Daniel Day-Lewis did this in the 80s. He played a certain... And so they had to do these roles. Jake Gyllenhaal had to do this in Brokeback Mountain. They had to do these certain roles, and then their careers opened up, okay? Yeah. Well, now they're in trouble for doing those roles if they don't actually portray the character's actual lifestyle. Like, it's come back on itself.
Yes. It's about the snake eating its own tail. And this is always what happens when you set the subversion as the standard, because if you start subverting, there's no reason for you to stop. So eventually you get bizarre terms like cultural appropriation and bizarre ideas like, simultaneously that you're a racist and, a colonizer. If you, what was it? If you adopt Haitian children, I mean, that is the ultimate in stupidity and the ultimate in misunderstanding the role of the human being in the world that was created for him. And I mean, inevitably, what can you possibly get from that except total chaos? And eventually chaos eats itself, and then you're left with, the ruined embers of nothing, and from there you start getting the green growth again. So I mean, this is the rhythm.
which relates back to your storytelling. This is what rotted away at the final trilogy of Star Wars was what you're talking about. And so it eats away at storytelling and good stories and looking for the next good book to read. But I don't want to run out of time and talk about this. I absolutely got so excited when I saw on your website that you teach on this. Can you talk about that?
Yes. Well, I'm working on a series of courses that I'm going to be offering, mostly in the craft of writing, because it's clear to me that there is a lot of interest and desire amongst especially Orthodox young people to express themselves in storytelling forms. But what our schools don't actually teach us, and this is something that I learned the hard way, is that we are not actually told the technique of narrative storytelling. We're taught the techniques of expository writing, of how to write a good essay. And so, but a lot of us end up reading widely, especially if we have that desire to write. It's probably because we've read a lot and we want to kind of reincarnate what we experienced in a new and fresh way. But we start doing it and it comes out, all backwards, because we think that we have the tools, but we're using the tools of essay writing as we're trying to craft a scene, and it all comes out wrong. And we can't understand why. And actually, it's not that difficult. There are some very simple techniques to learn. And as soon as you plug those in, things start to flow, because storytelling in itself is a kind of an ineffable and very interesting process, because you can start with an idea, you can start with the character, you can start with the character's desire, motivation, and some sort of a plot line. But what very often ends up happening is if you have the techniques, the story starts to take off on its own. And there's a moment of co-creation that happens between the writer and, I call it, God, where it's actually outside of your control. And some writers, authors talk about it as the characters taking over and doing what they want. But really, it's a moment of synergy where you give up your sense of, I have to control this thing, and allow it to kind of go on its own, as long as you have the basics in place. And learning those basics allows for this this incredible process of creation that's very freeing and very interesting. And that's what I'm working on right now as we speak. Actually, I'm working on the content of that course, and it's going to be probably coming out next month, hopefully with the intention of providing a series of courses specifically for Orthodox people and people who like to tell traditional stories in a new way, so that they can get those practical kind of ABCs and then take it from there themselves and write the stories that will come out of them, hopefully with inspiration.
I'm signing up.
Good.
I have this secret story I've been working on for 10 years, and I am not a good writer. I'm just not. I could talk all day. I could talk for days. but so I'm pretty excited. I saw that, and I was like, I think this could be right up my alley, because I have a fantasy novel inside me. I know it.
I think a lot of people do.
Yeah.
So, I'm all about getting those out there. And for those who are already on the cusp or have something more or less prepared, I do some story coaching through my Patreon page. If you don't mind a little bit of a plug here, but I have a Patreon community. It's most of the time it's people getting together to talk about books, and there's some very intelligent, very wonderfully smart people, more intelligent than I am, who come up with some very interesting ideas and things. But for those who are willing to be a little bit more involved and to pay on a little bit higher tier, I do provide story coaching specifically for authors who are already writing something. And we've had some really interesting breakthroughs. I've worked with about 5 or 6 people already. And there's going to be some fascinating novels coming out in the next few years. That's what I can tell you.
That's so exciting. That's what we're talking about. Like, we should not stop writing, fiction or fantasy. No. We have to keep this going. And yeah. Our faith gives us so many opportunities to tell some really incredible stories. Father Matthew, you look like you have a question.
Oh, I read a book a week and a half ago called The Lost Saint. It was just released by Ancient Faith Media by Christine Rogers. And so she got her early copy of her books and walked across the street and dropped one off at our house. And my wife and I both read it. And it was amazing. And it was exactly the engagement that you're talking about, of getting out of oneself and into this other character. And there were times, I'll admit it, during the story when I cried, because she portrayed the reality of this family's pain so well. And I was just enraptured in the story that I was having trouble putting it down. And honestly, there are many times I really enjoy watching movies and good movies. And I can watch a movie and say, wow, that was a really good movie, but it really doesn't compare to the investment in a really good book and a really good story. And I have to admit, as a priest, there are many times where I'll say, I don't want to read a narrative. I need to read something patristic or something that I'm going to use at church. So it's work, right? Yeah. And I think I have trouble finding good narratives and stories to read, just for the enjoyment of reading, right? Like that's my conflict personally, that I'm always trying to make it worthwhile rather than knowing that the whole activity is worthwhile in and of itself.
Well, and you're touching on something that's a sore point for me personally, and that's that the Orthodox publishing houses in general have not been good to fiction, and it's partially because they don't know what to do with it, and it's also partially because the book publishing business is changing very rapidly, and there's some pretty revolutionary stuff going on. But what I hope will happen, and I hope to have a prime mover position in this, is to be at the forefront of new ventures that make storytelling from Orthodox and traditional Christian authors more obvious, more available, while also making sure that the quality is there. Because there's plenty of people self-publishing who have not submitted themselves to the humbling experience of an editor.
Right.
And that's a tough game to play, because there's so few venues now that will accept fiction of a certain kind, fiction that that is inspiring and that is edifying. And many of the fantasy houses now have very specific submission guidelines that include things like you have to have a queer character, otherwise we won't accept you. Period. And there's a big swing back going, a big pendulum swing in traditional publishing. Well, a lot of the Orthodox publishers have not been able to do much with fiction. So hopefully, there's going to be new ventures, new companies, new people who are going to be able to kind of curate good stories and kind of have them vetted and prepared in a way that people like you, Father Matthew, can simply go, oh, I just need to go to that website or that newsletter or that publishing house, and everything that they have, I know is going to be worth it. That's what I'm hoping to do. I do have my own press, Waystone Press. We have several authors publishing through me. But I hope that eventually what happens around me is a kind of cooperative of independently minded writers who are all interested in the same kind of storytelling idea, so that they can fill that need, because there's a lot of people that would like to read this kinds of story, and there's not that many of them. So
if we can go in a slightly different direction, we've talked about writing stories and reading stories, but let's talk quickly about telling stories, because that's a different thing in and of itself. And can you, and I'm thinking about the people who say, well, I'd like to share my faith via story.
Yes.
Like, do you have a couple of tips for how, not just a good elevator speech, but how we can really make our oral storytelling more engaging?
Well, it's the same thing as writing. The advice is the same. You need to learn how to do it, meaning you need to get training in storytelling. And that doesn't have to be storytelling training in the sense of training. You don't have to become a trained teller of stories, as in the guy who goes on stage and tells stories professionally, with music in the background and with special effects and things like this, which is an entire genre unto itself. But telling, reading, and writing, they all share the same structure and they share the same techniques. So if you study how a good story comes across, meaning how can I tell a good story, and it can even be as simple as looking for marketing materials for copywriters, because there's tons of this kinds of stuff on the internet. All you have to do is, how do I sell? Put it in Google. How do I sell? And you find something like from Copyblogger or one of these copywriting schools or blogs, and you just follow what they say about how to sell an idea or a product. Because what they're doing actually is laying out a storytelling framework. And if you start thinking of it in that way, it becomes less about, I have this thing that I have to tell you, listen to me. And it becomes more about, enter into this world together with me, because I have a shared experience that I think you're going to love. Right? And too often when we tell stories of our faith, it's not about the faith, it's about us. I want to tell this and listen to what has happened to me. And I had this wonderful and fantastic transformational experience of conversion. And don't you want to have it with me? And the person across the table says, I have no idea what you're talking about, because you've just spent the last 15, 20 minutes telling me about something that is entirely in your own head. But it's about couching something that is universal in language that addresses the other person's interests and needs, not my own experience of something. And by humbling myself, then by making it about the other person, by even doing something so simple as saying, have you heard or have you had this experience of something? And then, because as soon as you use the word you, they'll be like, oh yeah, okay, I know what you're talking about. You know what I mean?
So, okay, see, that's helpful. I was like, that's a specific thing that people, it's very easy for them to change their vocabulary or their introduction to the story. Yeah.
Yep. Just use you instead of me. Yeah.
Yeah. This is an important part. And I love that you talked about this. We can all take a little bit of training just so that we have an easier time talking about our faith or God in the form of a story and learning what that looks like. And I appreciate you showing the exaggeration. We're not talking about getting on stage with the sound effects and the lights. No. This is something, and it really actually surprised me. It didn't take as much work as I thought it would for me, because I cared. If you care about this and you're trying to figure out overcome some of these conversational obstacles, learning some of this storytelling, verbal storytelling, it's amazing how it transforms your conversations.
Totally. Yeah. And it's about the posture of a learner, not the posture of a teacher. You can only become a teacher once you've taught yourself how to learn, and once you've reminded yourself that every teacher has to be a student for the duration of his or her life, and that there is never an end to that learning. And then in that humility, it's much easier to have a conversation where you're engaging the other human being, because you're focused on them, not on, am I telling the right story? Oh my gosh, am I doing the right thing? Oh my gosh, am I phrasing the introductory section in the right way that I have to? Because that's essay thinking, right? That's all about me. No, it's about engaging with the other human being across the table from you, and listening to what they have to say, and couching it in terms of a universal story that they can appreciate, not your own personal experience of it.
Well, I know we had you.
Such an orthodox thing. Like the teacher has to be the learner. Yeah,
it's true.
The paradoxical nature of our faith just came out right there.
Yes, it did. You gotta love the paradox.
What I wonder is, you probably see this. For those who don't know, what you have a day job up at seminary, right?
Yep.
And I know this with me doing retreats and talks on evangelism. I'll often get as much from them as they are hoping to get from me.
Oh yeah.
And they don't believe me when I tell them I'm probably going to get more from you than you're going to get from me.
It's possible.
Yeah.
but that's an indictment of us, not of them.
It's true. He did a retreat at my church last year. We taught him so much.
But I wonder, in the other work that you do with music, do you have people, you're the music teacher, right?
Yeah.
But you probably have students come along and they teach you things. And we have to have that humility as Orthodox Christians.
Well, of course, because so often, you come in with the idea of, this is what I'm going to teach them, and this is exactly how they're going to, absorb the information that I'm going to give them. And halfway through the class, you realize that everything you had planned on has simply fallen flat, and you have to do something from scratch. And the best way you can do it is by reading their cues and looking at their eyes and understanding what you can immediately see what resonates with them, and then going quickly deeper. It's like improv, right? Like stand-up comedy. You're constantly on your toes and watching and seeing what resonates, what doesn't, and having the humility and also the flexibility of moving wherever it needs to go. So yeah, constantly learning for sure.
Well, I'd like to give you the opportunity to close out however you want. I don't know what kind of parting words you have for us. I've shared a link to your website and your Patreon site, both in the comment section. Please go check that out. Like I said, I know what I'm signing up for. Go see if there's something for you. But what's the ending to our story today, Deacon Nicholas?
Well, we've been talking a lot about storytelling, but I haven't told you any stories. If you want to hear me telling stories, actual stories, listen to my new podcast. It's out from Ancient Faith Radio. We have 8 episodes out already. It's called In a Certain Kingdom. And honestly, listen to it not for me telling the story, but for the music. The music is composed by Natalie Wilson, who's a wonderful composer, and she just brings out all of the nuances, and it's amazing. But listen to it not only for the story, but because I give a little bit of context for why the stories work, and maybe you're going to start getting an idea of why this even matters in the first place. And maybe you'll come and talk to me then afterwards.
Oh, that's exciting. I like that. We will share a link to that in the comment section here soon. But yeah, that's such a great follow-up. So thank you so much for taking time out of your day, coming on here and telling us more about our title of the show. As I said, stories that work.
It's a great title.
I knew this going in. This is what I wanted to share, but I usually just, Father Matthew and I told him, I was like, it's great interviewing people. We just sit back and let them talk, so it's way easier than trying to come up with my own content.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And we will see you all next week. God bless.